We're going to be in 1 Samuel. We've been talking about Saul and David. And Saul, at this point in our narrative, we're in 1 Samuel 29, and Saul is still king, just barely. And we talked a lot about Saul and just how insecure he is as a leader, and I hope that many of you have been able to identify with Saul, maybe a little bit more than you anticipated. And this idea of Saul who, he's got his own kingdom, and everything's going his way, and then in trots David, right? This shepherd boy. And at first, Saul kind of sees him as a servant, somebody who can help him with his kingdom. And so, hey, play the harp for me. You make me feel better. Take out the giant. That really helps me feel better. Lead my armies. That makes me feel really good, until the people start, of course, praising David. And the Spirit of God leaves Saul because of his disobedience and comes on David. And Saul starts to feel threatened. And all of a sudden, David, who had been this servant that was going to help him with his kingdom, becomes a threat to his kingdom. And so we've looked at that and kind of realized that some of us kind of feel about Jesus that way, where at first, you kind of see him as your servant who's going to help you with all the things you've got planned in your life. And then at a certain point, he can feel like a threat. And many people, when you start talking to them about Christianity, talking to them about the Bible, it seems like a threat to the way that they live their lives, a threat to their plans for their life. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to look at a passage today where David is now in the camp of the Philistines. And he's among a bunch of non-Jewish people who don't worship Yahweh, who don't know the scriptures. And here is this Messiah. Here is this anointed king of Israel among the Philistines. And we're going to look at how they react to the presence of the Messiah in the camp. And hopefully you'll be able to relate to them as we go along. So we're going to start in 1 Samuel 28. Just look at a couple verses that we mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, and just setting up this story. So in chapter 28, it said, "In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, 'Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army.' And David said to Achish, 'Very well. You shall know what your servant can do.' And Achish said to David, 'Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life.'" Now, we talked about this. David has gone into the land of the Philistines because Saul is hunting him down to kill him, and he is feigning loyalty. He's pretending to be loyal to these Philistine rulers. And so Achish has become his buddy, and everything's been going beautifully. He gave him a city to live in. And David's been taking out the enemies of Israel while secretly telling Achish that, oh yeah, it was actually Israel that I was defeating. And this little game has been happening with David. And now everything is sort of coming to a head, because now Achish says, oh yeah, you're so faithful to me. You're always taking out Judah and Israel. So come with me. We're going to go and just wipe them out. And so David's in this really awkward position where he's been pretending he's loyal to the Philistines, and now they're asking him to go to war. So that brings us to 29. Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamping by the spring that is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish. Now, last week we looked at Saul and how he is freaked out by this huge gathering of Philistine armies, and he ends up finding out, and you can listen to that sermon on our website, but he ends up finding out that the Philistines are actually going to defeat Israel and kill him and his sons. Spoiler alert. And so we know what's happening here. And now David finds himself in the armies of the Philistines. You see the problem here. For one, he can't fight Israel. That would be wrong. But also, if he were to appear in battle with the Philistines, would they ever receive him as their king? No. So he's in this really bad position. So let's keep going. Verse 3. The commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign, for I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now, and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, 'He shall not go up with us to the battle.' Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning, and depart as soon as you have light." So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. But the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So David is wiping some sweat from his brow. That was a tight spot. This is the word of the Lord. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look a little bit at the Philistines and the Messiah. And first thing I want you to notice is that Achish thinks of David as a servant. He sees him as a servant to be used. And it's because of David's humility. Now, David is clearly the Messiah. Samuel, earlier in the book of 1 Samuel, anointed him, and the Spirit of God rushed on him. And since that point, he plays music, and it drives demons away. He goes on the battlefield and wins incredible victories. Like, God is with him. He is anointed. But right now, Saul is still sitting on the throne of Israel. And Saul, being threatened by David, has been persecuting him. David's been going and hiding in caves. He's been fleeing from one city to another. Some of the cities have almost surrendered him over to Saul. And he finally realizes the only way I'm going to get away from him is if I go to the Philistines. And so he shows up not as future Messiah, but as an exile. As someone who is wanted dead by the king of Israel, someone who has been rejected by Israel. And so he comes to him in this very humble way. And because of this humility, the way that David carries him, did you notice what Achish called him? He said, "Isn't this the servant of Saul? This is just a mere servant. And now he's my servant. He does whatever I tell him to do." And in Achish's mind, it's Achish that runs the show. He's the Lord. He's the king. And David is just his servant who will help him meet his goals, defend his interests. They're going to war, so David's got these mighty men who are great in battle. They're going to go with him and help him with his agenda. But of course, we know that David is not a mere servant. And so we look at David and what he says. Some of his responses are interesting. You notice this sort of, it's kind of like those spy movies where you got double agents and stuff. And David is playing this dangerous game. So in chapter 28, David says to Achish, when Achish says, hey, come with bring your men, we're going to go fight Israel. And he says, very well, you shall know what your servant can do. That's a pretty vague answer, right? Yeah, do against who? Right. Against the Philistines or against Israel? Because we know David has not attacked Israel at all, and he wouldn't. So it's a very vague answer. And then he does the same thing here in chapter 29, verse 8. After the Philistines have rejected David, David, he should win an Oscar for this. What have I done? When have you ever found anything but loyalty, in me? And he's just going on. But he says this, he says, what have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I might not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Now do you see the vagueness of that answer? He doesn't say, I'm going to fight against your enemies. He says, I'm going to fight against the enemies of my lord the king, which Achish assumes is him. Right. But who is David's lord the king? Saul, right. Could be Saul. Could even be Yahweh. Yahweh ultimately is the king, and the king of Israel was to recognize God as the supreme king of Israel. And so David, we've already seen he's loyal to Saul because he's technically on the throne, and he was anointed. And he's also loyal to Yahweh himself. And so when he says, I'm going to fight against the enemies of my Lord the king, well, it's actually the Philistines that are the enemies of the Lord, his king. So, again, whose servant is David? Well, he is a servant to Saul because Saul is the anointed one, the king, and he is a servant of the Lord. He serves ultimately what Yahweh wants. He knows Saul's out of his mind and isn't always directing him according to God's will. And so David knows Saul's days are numbered, but he still knows that right now Saul's on the throne. He is loyal to the king. He is loyal to Yahweh. But Achish looks at David, and he only sees a servant to be used. Now, the commanders of the Philistines, they see David as a threat. And in part because of the songs that they've heard. Like, haven't you heard the dances? Like, apparently these songs have even made it into Philistia, where people are starting to, break it out, and Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000. And, of course, 10,000 who? Primarily Philistines, right? That's primarily who David was killing when he was going to war with Saul. And so they're like, we don't trust this guy at all. Number one, we've seen what he did to Goliath. We've seen what he's done against our armies. This guy is famous for his courage in battle. And also, this guy is so popular among the common people in Israel, they just can't imagine that he's going to stay loyal to them. And they put two and two together. They're like, well, if he wants to go back and get back to Israel, what easier way than to handing them our heads, right? Yep. It's like by killing a bunch of us and saying, well, here, look what I've done for you, then they could welcome him back with open arms. Now, they really underestimate the insecurity of Saul. However, most of the people would gladly take David back. So they see him as a threat. Now, when you look at Saul started out like Achish, and he ended up like the commanders, which, by the way, just so you kind of understand how this works, the Philistines had 5 lords that ruled from different cities. And so Achish was the lord or king of Gath, and then there were 4 other commanders of the Philistines. And so that's why these other commanders are outnumbering Achish. And so when they call Achish a king, you might think, well, isn't he in charge? Well, not exactly. there's actually 5 lords. And so the other lords are overruling Achish. Achish is saying, I trust this guy. He's gonna be on our team. And the other 4 are saying, there's no way that guy's going with us. And so Saul, he started out like Achish. And he saw David as this little shepherd boy, this humble guy who's a servant and will do whatever he wants. But then eventually, as he sees him leading Israel's army and just God is blessing everything that David does, he starts to see him as a threat. And so he's kind of been on the same thing, but for all of them, for Saul, for Achish, for the commanders, they all refuse to acknowledge the Messiah as Lord. See, when God anoints someone, there's nothing you can do about it. And he gets to decide, not you. And this applies to a lot of things. Sometimes it might apply to your boss at work, and he's in charge and you're not. As much as you might feel it shouldn't be that way, right? This applies to a lot of different issues in life where there's someone who has authority, and ultimately you have to deal with it and you've got to trust God in it. But here we see the Messiah, David, as pointing to the ultimate Messiah, which will be Jesus. So look for a moment at Psalm 2. This is such an important psalm for understanding the Messiah and his role in Israel and the nations. Psalm 2, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, or his Messiah, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. So they don't want the Lord to reign. They don't want his Messiah to reign. They want to burst the bonds. They don't want to be subject to them. Verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, or pay homage to the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. You see, Israel was meant to be a light to the nations, including Philistia. And they were meant to reveal the one true God, because the pagan nations around them were worshiping many gods. And they were meant to reveal the one true God and expose all of the idols of the nations, all of the false religions and false ideas about God among the nations. And God's plan of salvation were centered on this person, the Messiah, the king that he would install on Zion. And the Messiah is Lord. And he says all nations, all the kings of the earth are to pay homage, to kiss the Son, to find refuge in him, because God is giving him the nations as his heritage. And so David, he didn't fulfill all of the prophecy here in Psalm 2, but he was given a promise that God would build him a house, and from his lineage would come the great Messiah who would sit on the throne forever. And so David is pointing to that Messiah. And so as we look at the Philistines, here are nations, here are rulers of the earth, and here is the Messiah. And are they bowing and paying homage to him? Are they recognizing who he is? Because the Spirit of the Lord is on this guy. He has been appointed to the throne, even though he's not sitting on it yet. This reminds you of anyone? Mm-hmm. We see the same thing in Jesus' life, who is anointed to be king of the universe, but he's not sitting on the throne yet, and so people don't recognize him. He comes in this humble way, like a man in exile. Very similar. You know, Jesus was also put on trial, because it's kind of like a trial here, in a sense where David and his men are there. Achish is declaring him faithful and loyal, and these rulers are saying, no, 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 we've heard songs about this guy. We've heard all the talk about this guy. This guy's trouble. And same way with Jesus. Jesus, like Achish, Pilate saw Jesus as just a mere servant. He saw nothing kingly or threatening about him. But like the commanders, the religious leaders saw Jesus as a threat. And what they're trying to do with Pilate is to convince him that Jesus is a threat to Rome, to Caesar, because he's declaring himself to be king, according to them. And the songs infuriated them just as much as they infuriated Saul and the Philistines. These songs about, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And like Achish, Pilate found Jesus innocent and yet gave in to the demand of the leaders. So in a very similar way, we see Jesus is declared innocent. Pilate's like, this guy's not a threat. He's not half the things you guys are saying, but everybody's upset. A riot's going to break out, so I'm going to give in to you guys, and we're going to find him guilty even though he's innocent. So what do we do? You know, I look at two people who are just a magnificent example of what you should do when the Messiah comes into your life. And one we've talked about. It's Jonathan. Now take a moment and just put yourself in Jonathan's shoes. He is the son of Saul. So imagine growing up, your dad is king, a powerful king anointed by the prophet, and you're going to battle, you're fighting in battles for him. And Jonathan was a good warrior. He was brave, he trusted God, and he stood up to his dad even a little bit and did what he thought was right. And really would have made a really good king when you look at Jonathan. And then along comes David. You think Jonathan, his whole life is, in his mind, is, hey, one day I'm going to get to be king. And it's intimidating. I don't know if I'll be as great of a leader as my dad. You'll be much better, Jonathan. But you know what I mean? Have you ever had those? You have this dream for your life. I'm going to be king. This is how it's going to be. And then in walks David. And he sees him, this little shepherd boy, confronting this giant, boldly declaring the word of God to him, taking no armor, no weapons other than a sling and stones, and he takes one stone and down goes the giant. And Jonathan saw that, and he was changed forever in that moment. And the next thing we know, Jonathan is there meeting David, and he's taking his princely robes and he's throwing them at his feet. He's taking his warrior's weapons and he's throwing them at the feet of the Messiah, saying, I have never seen anything like that. You are the Messiah. Reign in my place. Fight my battles. Beautiful picture of what we're meant to do when the Messiah comes into our life. Yes. You know, Jonathan's life was changed forever. That meant he would not be king. His whole life would be different. And yet, he embraced it and said, okay, you know what? This wasn't what I had planned, but now that you're here, you're in charge. Or how about Joshua? Joshua is a guy who I kind of feel a little bad for because he was always in the shadow of Moses. You imagine following that guy? Like, that would be really a hard guy to follow. And it's funny to me, you know, like even when Joshua is bringing them into the promised land and they cross the Jordan River. Well, the Jordan River is, you know, I mean, that was a miracle. It was during flood season, so it was pretty deep, but it's nothing compared to the Red Sea, right? Like, he gets this little measly little river to cross over, which is not nearly as impressive as Moses. And I think for Joshua, that's what he kind of felt like. I'm just, small fry. I'm just like, what am I compared to Moses? But yet God chose him. And so he's getting ready to go into his first battle, Jericho, this walled city, going to be probably the most difficult fortress to take. And while he's trying to plan it out, what's going to be the battle plan for taking out this city, this commander of the Lord shows up. This man shows up, and he's got a drawn sword. And so Joshua comes up to him and he says, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And, of course, this commander of the Lord says, "Neither. But as the commander of the army of the Lord, I've come to you." And so Joshua meets this guy who we believe was actually Jesus, the true Messiah himself, appearing to Joshua. And he comes into his life. He meets this Messiah. And that's this question: are you for us or for our adversaries? Now, if you're for us, well, then you're my servant. I'm the commander. I'm Joshua. So, hey, you look pretty good with that sword. Get in line. Get in the army, right? But no, he wasn't a servant for Joshua to boss around. He was the commander of the Lord's army. And so, or if he is for his adversaries, well, that would make him a serious threat. He's got a drawn sword. And so Joshua has to deal with this. Is this guy for me or against me? And the answer was neither. I am the Lord. I haven't come to take sides. I've come to take over, right? He is the Lord. And so what does he ask him to do? Well, he tells him to take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. One of the reasons we believe it's Jesus himself, because why would you have to do that in the presence of just an angel? And so he takes off his shoes, and Joshua bows down and worships. That's what you do when the Messiah comes into your life. And then the next chapter is all these battle plans for Jericho. It says the Lord said. Well, how did the Lord say it? Well, through the commander of the Lord's army. So the Messiah shows up and gives him instructions. That's what we're meant to do. So, Messiah, servant, threat, or Lord? I want you to do some soul searching in your own life. Perhaps you have thought of Jesus as a servant, and you wouldn't probably use those words. There was a popular t-shirt going around for a while, "Jesus is my homeboy." You remember that? Usually by people who didn't seem to follow him at all. And the idea was, hey, I run the show of my life. I'm in charge here. And Jesus is my homeboy. He's going to help me. He's on, as we said in our series about Saul, he's on Team Me, right? Team Me. And the Messiah, now he's going to be on Team Me, and he's going to help me with my plans for my life and my goals. He's going to make me feel better about myself, right? And that's how we see it. He's my homeboy. He's my servant, is really what you're saying. He's going to help me run, with my plans and my ambitions. So we see Jesus, and we're like, Jesus, you would make a great addition to Team Me. We could use a guy like you on Team Me. You could really make things work. But stop and think about that. Is Jesus just a servant, just someone who's going to help you with your plans? Or have you handed over the reins of your life over to Jesus and let him take control? That song, "Jesus Take the Wheel"? Right. But really it should be "Jesus Take the Keys." Right? Because you don't just want Jesus to take the wheel for that minute in that ride to help you get to where you're planning on going. You need Jesus to take your keys. He gets to drive all the time. He gets to decide if you go in the car or not. Right? Yeah. What you really need is you need Jesus' direction saying, maybe you shouldn't go here. Maybe this is what we should do. letting him actually have control. I mean, it's one thing to let someone take the wheel. It's another thing to hand them your keys. Well, I need those. I might need those. We like to have that control, don't we? Have you laid your weapons and your rights down at his feet? Have you taken your shoes off and worshiped him as your new commander and Lord? Have you kissed the Son, paying homage to him? Have you taken refuge in him? Or are you still calling the shots and plans of your life and just inviting Jesus to help you? You know, our prayer life should be more about, Jesus, what do you want from me in my life? Where am I going? Not, hey, Jesus, help me with this, help me with that, and help this to go really well, right? Sometimes our prayer life's like that. When really we should be seeking his will for our life and his wisdom. Jesus isn't just a servant to be used. Now, some people think of Jesus as a threat. He might interfere with their plans or even oppose them. He might take the reins of your life and move you in a whole direction you didn't want to go. You know, like how many people have said, oh, you know, I don't want to become a Christian. He's going to, you know, make me be a missionary in Africa or something, you know. Which actually sometimes that sounds wonderful to me. Although hot, very hot. I don't know. My pale European skin is very, you know, weak. I can't take the sun. But, you know, do you trust Jesus? You know, it's kind of threatening for someone in absolute authority to come into your life because he could do anything. And so you may see that, you know, being the Messiah, when the Messiah comes in, it means the end of your reign, right? Like for Jonathan and for Saul, when the Messiah comes into your life, it means, oh, I'm not in charge anymore. The Messiah's here. And that can seem like a threat. And so you can try to be like Saul and chase him out, but in the end, the Messiah is going to have his way, and he's just going to wait for you to realize it. You can only fight him for so long, like Saul of Tarsus. You know, it's hard to kick against the goads. And eventually, Jesus is going to break through all those walls you're putting up. But when you think about it, this is actually good news. Because Jesus is the only one that can really bring the joy, the peace, the righteousness that you long for. He's the only one that can fix the train wreck that your life's going to be without him, right? Yep. The early church, their great confession was Jesus is Lord. And people found that embracing the Messiah as Lord, they found new identity, new purpose, and new freedom. Now, C.S. Lewis, in his classic book, Mere Christianity, he talks about morality. And it's an illustration I've used before, but it's so good, I want you to keep it in your mind. And he talks about these 3 different levels of morality and how most of us, we only think of 2 levels. We think of how does something affect me and how does something affect the other people around me, right? These 2 basic levels of morality. But he says there's actually a 3rd level, and he uses 2 metaphors to illustrate this. So one is musicians. Some of you are musicians. Now, if you're a musician, you first have to think of yourself, right? Is your instrument in tune? I've told the story before, but I can't help it. I'm sorry. I was in choir in junior high, and we were right next to the band room where all the band students were playing, and we were convinced they were torturing zoo animals in there. It was so bad. It was really bad. They ended up, eventually becoming, many of them, very good musicians, but it's rough, right? You need to be in tune. Like, that's really important, because if you're not in tune, it's painful. So are you in tune? Are you playing with proper technique? Are you playing the right notes, the right rhythm? So you think about yourself. And then you have to think of others. Are you playing in time with other people? Are you playing the same song in the same key? I've told you the story before about this beautiful older couple that came to our Bible college, and I loved them so much. And they were playing a piano piece, and I don't know how old they were. They were up there in their years, and they're like really just going at it, and they're doing a duet, on the piano, the two of them. And it was kind of like really busy and chaotic, what they were playing. And pretty soon the man leans over to his wife and he's like, "What are you playing?" And she shouts something back and he's like, "Oh," and then it sounded beautiful, They're playing two different songs. And so my roommate leans over to me and says, "That's you and Sarah someday, Jeremy." He may be right. So, are you playing the same song in the same key, right? But there is a third level, C.S. Lewis says. And that third level is this idea of what are you for? What is the purpose for your playing? Are you playing for a wedding? For a funeral? For a dinner party? An art showing? What are you playing for? Because that makes a big difference, right? So if you are playing for a wedding and you're doing all this somber, moody music, guess what? That's not going to really help. Everyone's going to be frustrated with you, right? And so you can be playing really well with the right, the right technique, the right tuning. You can be playing with other people, but if you're playing something that's inappropriate for the context you're in, then you're missing it, right? Well, some of us need the Messiah to come into our life and tell us the hard news. Hey, that music you've been playing is for the wrong thing. You've been making music for the wrong purpose. There's actually something else much bigger you're missing. You're missing what's really going on in life. The second metaphor he used is ships. So first, again, we think of ourselves. You make sure that your boat's not going to sink, right? That doesn't have holes in it, that the engine or the sails are in proper repair and everything's working properly. And that's important. But then you also think of other ships, right? You don't want to crash into them or get in their way or make their job harder. But C.S. Lewis says there's a third level, and that is, if it's a fleet of ships, where are you going? Right? Where are you going? And some of us, we've been going around in circles our whole lives. Or maybe you're like Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean, and you've got this compass, and it keeps changing based on your desires. Don't we live our lives that way sometimes? Yep. You just run after this and run after that, and then you can't decide what you want. And what you need to chuck that compass at the feet of Jesus and say, "Jesus, where am I supposed to be going? Right. Where do you want me?" Figuring out what your life is for. What are you for? Where are you going? And only Jesus can really answer those questions. What are you for, and where should you be going? So let's talk about this. What are you for? Well, not to rule and win glory. So Achish and these commanders, I just bummed out Liz. Just like, man. King Achish and these commanders of the Philistines, they look at themselves as kings, rulers, who are aided by God and armies, and they're here to rule and to reign and to win glory for themselves and their people. But truthfully, they're meant to know and glorify God. And so the Messiah being among them was meant to show them there is actually a God above all the idols that they've been worshiping. The Philistines seemed to just sort of adopt whatever gods were in the lands that they went to. And so they kind of saw gods as sort of, again, their servants that helped them accomplish their agenda. And what David's presence was meant to be for them was this wake-up call to, you know what, there is one God who doesn't cave into your agenda. He scraps your agenda. You have to throw your agenda at his feet because he is the supreme God you give an account to. And what you're really made for as a human being is to know and to glorify God. And truthfully, you've alienated yourself from this God because your own rebellion, and for the Philistines, they were currently persecuting his people, Israel. Now, this is true for us as well. Many of us, we see ourselves as autonomous. We live our lives our way, doing what we feel in our heart is right. We shape our identities. We carve ourselves this destiny of purpose and meaning. And Jesus might seem like he could help you on that quest. But that's not what he's interested in. He's actually, we're like those Philistine rulers. We have this idea that's totally wrong. We have this false vision for our lives and what it's about. And what he really wants to do is just wake us up so we can throw all of that at his feet and find out what you're really meant for. We're people made in the image of God, made to reflect his character, both to the people around us, to our own families. Like, we're meant to actually be reflections of him, and it's only by focusing our minds and hearts on him that we can become more like him. And so the Messiah is the one who comes into our life and shows us who God is, shows us who the Messiah is, so that we can begin to be changed and transformed through our relationship with the Messiah. As the Westminster Catechism says, you were made to glorify him and enjoy him forever. That's what you are for. And where should you be going? Now, again, looking at Achish and these Philistines, it's not earning earthly greatness with heavenly aid. Sometimes that's how we see it, right? We're going to make this great story for ourselves, and God's going to help us get there. You ever felt like that? That's how the Philistines felt. We are making ourselves famous with all of our exploits, and the gods are going to help us. The gods are going to help us get there. But the reality is, we should be discovering God's heavenly greatness and following the earthly path of his Messiah. Yes. Truthfully, these Philistines are invited to lay all of their earthly greatness down in the dust and discover the heavenly greatness of the one true God. That's what really mattered, right? Not who won this war and whether they're going to be successful in all their exploits, but here is the Messiah, and he knows the one true God. The Spirit of that one true God is on this man. And that's what they really need. That was the key to their whole life, is knowing this one true God above all gods, that heavenly greatness, and then following the earthly path of his Messiah. See, David, again, was humble. He exiled himself on behalf of God's people, pointing to Christ, who ultimately would come in humility, and he would be exiled for us, right? He takes our sin. He takes our offenses against this God that we've offended, takes them on himself, and he is cut off from the presence of the Lord, and he dies in our place, taking a curse for us, so that we could be reconciled to this God. And so David here is a picture pointing to this ultimate Messiah, that we're supposed to find the true heavenly greatness and the true God. And it comes through beholding Jesus, his Messiah, and then we follow the earthly path of the Messiah. That's very different, isn't it? Following the earthly path of this man walking around like an exile. Jesus in his earthly life, I don't remember him sitting on the throne. Do you? Right. Piling up wealth and good things and building big houses for himself. I don't remember that part. We are following somebody who lived very differently. And that's the path we're called to follow. When you're trying to figure out your life, you're looking and following the earthly path of God's Messiah, discovering his heavenly greatness, following this earthly path of his Messiah, which is very different. So the same is true of us. Are you living your life trying to earn earthly greatness? I think we all do this to some degree, if we're honest. It's just instinctive in us, right? And Jesus laid down all of his heavenly greatness so that he could come and live a life that is worthy of imitating, and he could save us from all of this junk we've been giving ourselves to, right? He came down and he left that so that he could live this life of humility and rescue us from this vanity of living for human greatness. Earthly greatness really is a vapor. You think of this like even in sports. You know, you get so excited about them winning a game and then they lose a game. I mean, even when the Red Wings won the Stanley Cup Finals in 2008, yeah, it's been that long. We're all celebrating, you're on cloud nine, and then what happens just a couple months later? The next season starts. Guess what? You're not. You're really not the champion anymore. Now you've just got to get in line with everybody else and earn it again, right? Earthly greatness is fleeting. You can work really hard and not get a promotion and not get a raise. You can be overlooked, and somebody that's not even as qualified as you can be put into a place, right? Make more money than you. Earthly greatness it's fleeting. It's a vapor, and it's just never going to satisfy you. It's never going to make you happy and fulfilled as a human being. And what Jesus is doing is he's saying, I have something so much better. Jim Elliot famously said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. Amen. So you can't keep this earthly greatness that you're achieving and building for yourself. So why not throw it at the feet of the Messiah and trade it in for true heavenly treasure, the greatness of knowing God and following the path of his Messiah. So the Messiah is not a servant to be used. He is a Lord to be worshiped and trusted. He's not a threat to be eliminated. He is a Lord to be followed and obeyed. So what are you going to do with the Messiah? Now just take an honest look at your life for a minute and just think about it. What's the first time you really met Jesus in your life? And maybe did you have the wrong idea of who he was and what he was for? Did you just see him as, oh, this is the guy who's going to make all my dreams come true? Oh, this is the guy who's going to help me get things together? Or did you really recognize who he is, that he is the Lord, the Messiah, the true King, the one I desperately need to open my eyes so I can scrap my plans and discover true greatness and the true path of my life? Have you seen him as just a servant to help you with your plans, or a threat to your plans for your life? Have you pushed him away, or even keep him at a distance so he doesn't, mess with things too much? So what have you done with him? And then secondly, what are you doing with him right now? See, Jesus doesn't dwell on the past. He's interested in right now. The Messiah is here. And he is full of grace. He is full of love. He's not going to condemn you for your failures in the past. But he's asking you right now, what are you going to do with him now? He's here. Are you going to keep pushing him out? Are you going to keep trying to just use him for your plans? Or are you going to actually throw your plans at his feet and say, okay, Jesus, we're doing things your way. I'm done with my way. Have you thrown down your weapons? It's easy sometimes for us. We've got our weapons. Maybe they're your tongue. You like to lash out at people. Maybe you like to manipulate people. Maybe you like to gossip about people. You have weapons to get what you want, and you got to lay all those weapons at the feet of Jesus. You're not going to need those anymore. Throw all of those down. Throw down your kingly garments, your treasures, your ambitions, this illusion that you're in charge of your life. Your right to rule your life and carve your destiny. Throw those at his feet because his plans are better than yours. Yes. His ways are better than yours. Scrap your plans and bow at his feet and worship. Now, Paul was a great example to us of this. He had spent his whole life earning earthly greatness. And Saul, he became, being Jewish, he became the most intelligent, knowledgeable, zealous, scrupulous Jew on the planet. Like all the earthly greatness you could get, he had it. Everybody was impressed by him. His intelligence, his talent, his integrity, his zeal. And then the Messiah showed up and messed everything up for him. But when he met the Messiah, he realized that everything he had done, from his education to his zealous devotion to the law and weeding out what he saw as heretics from the church, he saw all of that as just rubbish compared to knowing Christ, right? And knowing Christ, that just opened up this whole heavenly treasure of knowing the greatness of the true God as he's revealed in his Christ in this humble path, which was way different than the path that Saul had been treading. And so that's what I'm inviting you to do, is to just take whatever path you've been on, whatever treasures you've collected, whatever plaques might be on your wall, so to speak, and throw them at his feet, and let's surrender to him. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for sending your Son, that you didn't just send your Son for Jews. You sent your Son for all nations, all people groups, all ethnic groups. And we rejoice in that fact, that though we were once outsiders and outside the covenant of your people, that we have been brought in through your Messiah. And Lord, you brought the Messiah into our lives just as you did these Philistines. And yet our Messiah is so much greater than David, because he took our sin. He died in our place. He brought us to you. He reconciled us to the true God of the universe. And he's revealing the true heavenly greatness that we long for and the earthly path we are meant to walk. And I pray, God, that, Lord, you would just help us to see the futility of earthly greatness and of our own plans for our lives. And that, God, you would help us to throw them at your feet and just say, Jesus, you know what? Your plans are better than mine. You're not my servant, going to help me with all my plans. You're not a threat to what I really want to do. You really are Lord. And I just want to stop fighting you. Stop trying to boss you around and imagine you're on my team. But Lord, I just want to bow at your feet and say, have your way with my life. Show me who I am. Show me what I'm for. Show me where I'm going. Jesus, we need you. And so today we just want to throw everything at your feet and say, Jesus, show us how to live our lives. Show us who we are. Help us know God in a way that we haven't up till now. Open up to us just the wonders of who he is, his love, his sovereignty, his power, his justice, his goodness and his kindness and his mercy. God, show us who God is, and let us follow you on this path that you've carved for us, living life the way we're supposed to be, God, for your kingdom and not for ours. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.